When the pre-scene comes out, people generally tend to go one of two ways. They will either read it once, decide they've got the general idea, and then leave it alone, or they will disappear into it for 2 weeks, highlighting notes, frameworks, trying to know every page off by heart. I think that both approaches miss the point, so in this video, I'll show you what I think you actually need from the pre-scene, what you should be looking for, and when you should stop. If you go and read a few pre-scene guides, you will see the same thing. They will tell you that the pre-scene is background, it's context, it isn't there to give you the answers, which is fine. Then the next bit is usually spend the next 2 weeks analysing it and analysing it. And that's where I think the advice goes a bit wrong. If it really is background, what are you actually trying to get from it before the exam? That's a question that I want to answer. There's two facts that decide everything, and there are two things about the pre-scene that should change how you prepare for it. The first is that it's on screen, it's in the exam, you've got the document there while you're answering. The second is that your annotated copy is not. So all those highlighted and margin notes that you've made at home are going to stay at home. So if you're spending your time trying to memorize a document, you're solving a problem that you don't actually have. So the document is coming with you, but the notes that you make are not. So what is it actually for? What do you actually need from it? And there's four things. You want the business to feel familiar before the clock starts. You want to understand the language that the sector uses, and you want to know where things are so you can find them quickly. And you want a benchmark, something that you can compare the new information against, and that's enough. You don't need to have reached all your conclusions before the exam because nobody has asked you the question yet. So what to look for? The ACCA actually gives you a useful list here, and it has 8 things. How old is the business? How big is it? Is it listed? How is it performing? How does it make its money? Where does it sit in the sector? What's its strategy? Are its resources enough? And what about its ethics, CSR, and values? I'm deliberately not turning that into another framework. It's just a checklist of what you should understand. And because there are 8 of them, you can actually finish in the time frame. So the sector's language is particularly important. Every industry has measures that mean something to the people who are working in it. Occupancy, load factor, revenue per appointment. If you don't know what one of those measures means, the number beside it isn't going to help you very much. You can see that a number has fallen, which is fine. But is that good? Is it bad? Or is it normal? That's what you need to know before you get into the exam. All right, so tensions. What are the tensions in the business? Growth versus control, investment versus constraint, innovation versus risk. Those things are worth noticing, but don't turn them into predictions because you're not trying to decide which tension is going to appear in task 1. You're just getting familiar with the business and the things that pull in different directions. The task will tell you which one matters and then stop. So this is the bit that people find most difficult. You've got 8 factors, you understand the sector's language, you can see the main tensions in the business, which is good, but you don't need another model. What you do need is to find out what's actually important. So you don't need to fill another spreadsheet, and at some point you've done the job that the pre-scene is there to do. Once you've done that, it's a good time to stop. So what to do and what to understand fast. So what you're trying to get good at is now finding things. So where is the business model? Where are the objectives? Where are the financial facts? Where are the values and ethical issues? You should be able to open a document and get to those things quickly by memory, knowing where they are if you need them, because you don't want to spend the exam scrolling through 10 pages looking for a number that you know is in there somewhere. So every minute that you spend hunting is a minute that you're not answering. So here's a simple test which I like and teach my students. So close the pre-scene, give yourself about a minute, 90 seconds maybe. Can you explain what the organization does, how it makes money, how it's performing, where it's going, and what language that you need to understand, and then open it and see how quickly you can find the evidence for those things. That's a combination which you're after, so you understand the business, but you can also find the detail. This is an important distinction. Knowing the whole business off by heart isn't the same thing as knowing your way around it. You can remember loads and still waste time in the exam looking for a fact. I'd rather you remembered less and knew exactly where to find the important stuff. So that's going to be a navigation, and that's much more useful on the day. So the part that actually earns marks, now we get to the part which is going to affect your answer. So suppose that the pre-scene tells you the organisation values innovation. Good. Then in the exam, you get an exhibit about a proposal. So what do you do with that information? And there are 3 ways this usually goes. And only one of them is doing what you want. So here's the first one. The organisation values innovation. So this proposal is a good fit. So that sounds reasonable, but look at the sentence. Where's the evidence from the exhibit? There isn't any. You've used something you knew before the exam and turned it into the answer, and that becomes a problem. Then we have bolted on. The second version is a little better. The proposal is consistent with the organisation's stated values, or the organisation's stated values. So at least you've mentioned the proposal, but what have you actually said about it? You've put the proposal next to the value and then you've stopped. So you haven't told the reader what the proposal means, what the problem is, or what they should make of it. Now look at this one. The exhibit shows a proposal. It cuts a development budget by 1/3, which is your evidence. That shows the release cycle the organisation depends on to stay ahead, and that's your analysis. Then you bring in the pre-scene. Innovation is one of its stated commitments, so the saving is bought at the cost of something that the organisation says makes it competitive. That's where the pre-scene belongs. It helps you judge what you've been given, but it doesn't replace what you have been given. So that's a rule that I would keep. The pre-scene, it gives you the standard. The exhibit gives you the thing that you're judging. So keep those 2 jobs separate. Once you understand that, quite a few of the usual mistakes will become much easier to spot. So here's a very quick test which you can use whilst you're writing. So ask yourself this. Would this sentence still be true if the exhibit wasn't there? If the answer is yes, you probably started writing about the pre-scene instead of answering the task. So go back, find the evidence in the exhibit, put that first, then use the pre-scene to explain why it really matters. So there are 3 things that I would avoid, and they're particularly tempting when you've spent a lot of time preparing the pre-scene. So first, trying to memorize it. Second is predicting what you're going to ask. And third is taking your prepared material into the exam and trying to find somewhere to use it. So let's take one of them at a time. You don't need to learn the document word for word. It's on screen. What you do want is the familiarity. So you want to know what the business does. You want to understand its measures. You want to know where the important information lives, and be careful with annotations as well. So highlighting can be useful if it helps you understand something, but the highlighted copy isn't actually coming into the exam. So don't mistake seeing lots of colour on your document for being ready. Then the next one is question spotting. You read the pre-scene and something jumps out. You think that's probably going to come up, so you prepare for it. Then you spend more time in it because you prepared it and now you've invested in it. The problem comes when the task asks you something else. So you've built an answer to the question you expected rather than the one you've actually been given. That's where the trouble will start. There's a good example of this in the published material. So issues had been discussed online before an exam, then some candidates wrote those issues into the first task even though they weren't relevant to what they'd been asked. I think there's a simple reason that happens. So if you've spent 15 hours preparing something, you want those 15 hours to count. So when the exam doesn't ask for it, there's a temptation to find somewhere to put that away or put it in there regardless. That's exactly why I want you to stop when the pre-scene work is done. So the more material you prepare, the harder it can be to leave behind. One small point, but stop writing. So the pre-scene, you're writing to a chair, a chief executive, a finance director. They know the company. They don't need you to tell them that something was stated in the pre-scene. If the company closed 2 sites, right, the company closed 2 sites, and that's it. You're writing as an advisor, so write for the person reading the answer, not for the exam candidate sitting beside you. And then when the exam starts, let the pre-scene go. You spent 2 weeks with this company, you know things about it, you've probably got opinions about it, which is fine. Leave all of that behind unless the task gives you a reason to use it. The question at the start of the exam is very simple. What have they asked me to do and what evidence have they given me to use? And that's where you're going to start. So when you are done, how do you know when you've done enough? I wouldn't give you a number of hours. Instead, check 6 things. Can you explain the business model without opening the document? Can you name the strategic objectives? Do you understand the sector's language? And can you find the important facts quickly? Can you explain the main tensions? And can you stop yourself trying to predict the answer? If you can do those things, you're done. And that's important because you've still got the rest of your study time. Use it to answer questions that you haven't seen before. That's the skill you actually need to build. The pre-scene can't give you that because you've already seen it. So don't let the document take over the fortnight. Get familiar with the business, learn your way around it, and then spend your time doing the thing you actually have to do in the exam, which is answering unfamiliar questions. If you remember one thing from this video, make it this. Don't try to know the pre-scene better than everyone else. Get better at using it when the task actually asks you to use it. That's what all of this will come back to. And one final point. So knowing the pre-scene doesn't teach you how to write an SBL answer. Those are different skills. You have to practice something about writing it. So get the answer marked and see exactly where the answer stopped earning marks. And that's really why I built Exhibit A. So you will write an SBL tasks. It will get marked and coached down to the sentence where it stops scoring. So your first marked answer is free when you sign up at sblexhibita.com. It's independent and it's not affiliated with ACCA. So thanks again for studying with me, Sean Freeland, on SBL. And if I don't see you again, best of luck with the exam.